The man who designed the iPhone couldn't design a house he was satisfied with. That sentence sounds like a clever contradiction, but for Steve Jobs, it was real life. While millions of people carried his vision in their pockets, smooth glass, perfect curves, ruthless simplicity, he spent years unable to finish the one place he was supposed to live inside. No final blueprint, no completed home, no moment where he could say, "This is enough." The man obsessed with details slept on a mattress on the floor. No couch, no dining table, no sense of arrival. And that wasn't because he lacked money, taste, or options. It was because he couldn't tolerate imperfection even when imperfection was unavoidable. In the American imagination, the house is more than a structure. It's a reward, proof that the struggle meant something. From post-war suburbs to Silicon Valley mansions, a finished home has always signaled the same message: you've made it. Steve Jobs resisted that message. In the late 20th century, an era when CEOs built estates and displayed success, the square footage Jobs went in the opposite direction. Not small, not modest, but unfinished, intentionally unresolved. This wasn't minimalism as trend. It was minimalism as refusal. Refusal to commit. Refusal to settle. Refusal to live inside something that didn't match the picture in his head. Jobs once said that simplicity was the ultimate sophistication. But simplicity, for him, wasn't about comfort. It was about control, eliminating everything that didn't feel right. That instinct built Apple. It also followed him home. He could redesign a product line overnight. He could demand the impossible from engineers and get away with it. But a house was different. A house didn't reset. You couldn't ship a version 2 of your life without living through version 1 first. And Steve Jobs never trusted version 1. Visitors were often unsettled by what they found. A billionaire's home without furniture, rooms that echoed, spaces that felt provisional, as if he might leave at any moment. It looked peaceful. From a distance, up close, it felt unresolved. Jobs didn't decorate because decoration implied satisfaction. Choosing a chair meant accepting that this chair was good enough. Hanging a picture meant admitting the wall would no longer change. Completion was a commitment, and commitment scared him. This wasn't about being ascetic. Jobs loved beauty. He loved materials. He loved perfection more than almost anyone else alive, but only when it could be absolute. A finished house would have required compromise with reality, with time, with limits, and Steve Jobs built his entire identity on refusing limits. The irony is unmistakable. The man who helped humanity feel at home inside technology never fully allowed himself to feel at home anywhere else. And that contradiction, the unfinished house, the empty rooms, the pursuit of perfection without rest, is where this story truly begins. The unfinished rooms we left behind at the end of part 1 weren't a starting point. They were an afterimage. Before the empty spaces, before the mattress on the floor, there was once something far more American, something heavy with history, wealth, uncertainty, a mansion. In the late 1980s, when Steve Jobs purchased a secluded property in Woodside, California, he didn't start with nothing. He inherited a massive, early 20th century estate, an old house built when American success was measured in scale, permanence, and timber-thick to last 100 years. It was the kind of home the country once admired deeply: tall ceilings, grand staircases, walls designed to outlive the people inside them. For many Americans, this would have been the final chapter, the reward at the end of the climb, proof that the journey worked. For Jobs, it felt like a mistake. To understand why, you have to understand the America Jobs Washington's pushing against. By the late 20th century, Silicon Valley had created a new elite one that measured power not in land, but in ideas. Speed mattered more than permanence. Flexibility mattered more than legacy. The old symbols of success suddenly looked slow. The mansion represented an older America. An America that wanted to be rooted. Jobs didn't. He wasn't interested in occupying history. He wanted to erase it. So he made a decision that stunned neighbors, preservationists, and city officials alike. He planned to tear the house down. At first, it seemed simple. He had the money, he had the land, he had the vision, but reality pushed back. Local preservation groups protested, arguing the home was part of California's architectural heritage. Permits stalled, hearings dragged on, lawyers entered the picture, years passed. For most people, this would have been the moment to compromise. Renovate instead of demolish, adapt instead of resist. Steve Jobs did neither. He waited, and waiting, for him, was not weakness, it was defiance. As America rushed forward through the internet boom, through rising fortunes and falling startups, Jobs was frozen in a quiet standoff with the physical world. The house stood where it always had, unwanted yet undefeated. Friends noticed something unsettling. The same man who moved faster, ruthlessly in business, seemed strangely immobile at home. He could reinvent industries, but couldn't bring himself to accept a roof that didn't feel philosophically exact. Eventually, after years of resistance, Jobs won. The mansion came down. What people expected next, a bold new structure, a modernist statement, something worthy of a visionary, never arrived. The land remained empty. This was not indecision. This was conviction taken too far. Jobs didn't replace the house, because replacing it would have meant committing to a version of the future, and commitment, to him, felt irreversible. In American culture, building is an act of faith that the future will accept you. Steve Jobs wasn't ready to offer that faith to anything that couldn't meet his standards completely, so he chose absence over compromise. And that decision, the choice to live without a finished home, rather than accept an imperfect one, set the pattern for everything that followed. The empty land left behind in Woodside didn't mark an ending. It marked a shift. After the mansion was gone, and nothing replaced it, Steve Jobs didn't search for another grand project. Instead, he carried the logic of absence with him. If the perfect house couldn't exist, then life itself would remain provisional. This is where the story moves inward, because while America was entering an era of excess, the dot-com boom, exploding real estate values, CEOs turning homes into statements, Jobs chose to live in spaces that felt almost unfinished by design. Visitors were often unprepared for what they found, not poverty, not austerity, but deliberate incompleteness. Rooms without furniture, floors without rugs, walls without art, sometimes nothing more than a mattress on the floor and a single light overhead. No markers of comfort, no signals of permanence. In a culture where a home is meant to express identity, Jobs erased his. To many Americans, minimalism reads as virtue. It echoes the Puritan instinct, the belief that excess dulls the soul. Jobs' life appeared to align with that tradition. He owned little, wore the same clothes, rejected ornamentation. But this wasn't modesty. It was discipline. Jobs believed objects competed with thought, that every unnecessary item took up mental space better, reserved for clarity and vision. This idea fit neatly into the Californian translation of Zen philosophy that had reached America in the 1960s and was embraced by a generation disenchanted with materialism. Empty space meant freedom. Simplicity meant truth, at least in theory. In practice, something darker crept in. Those close to him noticed that his homes didn't feel calming. They felt guarded, as if any object that entered had to pass a test. Nothing was allowed unless it belonged indefinitely. A chair meant deciding how to sit. A table meant deciding where to gather. Furniture meant accepting habits. Jobs wasn't ready for habits. He lived as if he were always between versions of himself, never arriving, never settling, never declaring anything final. This way of living mirrored how he treated products, relentless refinement, constant dissatisfaction, endless iteration. The problem was simple. Products benefit from iteration. Human lives do no. In American storytelling, success ends with rest. The hero builds something and then lives inside it. But Jobs never allowed himself that phase. To rest felt like stagnatio. To settle felt like betrayal of possibility. His minimalism wasn't peaceful. It was vigilant. Rooms were kept empty because they satisfied him, but because they hadn't failed him yet. The absence of choice delayed disappointment. If nothing was chosen, nothing could be wrong. And slowly, the line between simplicity and avoidance disappeared. This wasn't loneliness in the obvious sense. Jobs was surrounded by people, influence, power. But there was a quiet distance between him and ordinary human comfort. The kind that comes from repetition, from familiarity, from worn in not left pristine. Comfort requires acceptance. Acceptance requires limits. Steve Jobs resisted both. By stripping his surroundings to their bare minimum, he postponed the final question he feared most. When do you stop improving and start living? The question we ended with in part 3 still hangs in the air. When do you stop improving and start living? For Steve Jobs, the honest answer was unsettling. Almost never. The empty rooms, the unfinished spaces, the refusal to settle, they weren't symptoms of indecision. They were signals of a deeper belief that had followed him his entire life. Good enough was not neutral. It was wrong. To understand that belief, you have to step back into the American idea of progress itself. The United States was built on improvement. From assembly lines to skyscrapers, from highways to software. Every generation was taught the same lesson. Faster is better, newer is stronger, and settling is losing. Good enough was tolerated only when there was no alternative. Steve Jobs didn't just inherit that mindset. He sharpened it into an absolute. If something could be better, allowing it to exist as it was felt dishonest. If a detail was wrong, no matter how small, it contaminated everything around it. At Apple, this logic became law. Engineers learned quickly that defending a compromise was dangerous. Designers learned that finishing early was suspicious. Products were rejected not because they failed, but because they hadn't yet reached inevitability. Jobs wasn't chasing improvement, he was chasing rightness. And the results were undeniable. The Macintosh changed personal computing, the iPod redefined music, the iPhone reshaped human behavior. Each success reinforced the same brutal lesson: perfection, pursued without mercy, works. So why wouldn't it work everywhere else? But houses are not machines. Lives are not products. You can delay a launch. You can ship an update. You can revise a design. You cannot do that with time. Yet Jobs behaved as if life were endlessly editable, as if postponement carried no cost, as if there would always be a later version where things finally aligned. Friends artist that the same standards that drove his brilliance also made him hard to live with. Almost was never enough, not in work, not in choices, not even in relationships. Acceptance felt like surrender. In traditional American culture, the home is where ambition slows down, where the fight ends, where good enough becomes a blessing, not a failure. Jobs never allowed that transition. A furnished house would have meant admitting he had arrived. Arrival meant stopping. And stopping felt like death long before illness ever appeared. This is where perfection turned from strength into trap. The discipline that filtered out mediocrity also filtered out comfort. The moral clarity that produced great products erased room for a human softness. Jobs' internal judge didn't rest and it didn't forgive, so he lived in a suspended state, always refining, always waiting, always convinced that the next version of the house, of life, of himself would finally be worthy. And maybe that belief is the most American thing about him. A nation addicted to progress creates heroes who never know when they're done. If perfection was the judge, then Zen became the defense. At the end of part 4, we saw how good enough crossed a line for St. Jobs, how acceptance felt like failure, and finishing felt like surrender. What allowed him to live with that pressure, even justify it, was a belief system that sounded gentle on the surface, but hardened into something else entirely. Zen. To Americans in Jobs' generation, Zen wasn't a religion. It was a counterweight. In the aftermath of Vietnam, Watergate, and the collapse of blind faith in institutions, simplicity became a form of rebellion. Clean lines were honesty. Emptiness was clarity. Restraint was wisdom. Jobs encountered Zen in the 1970s, when young Americans were searching for meaning outside consumer culture, and it stayed with him not as an escape from ambition, but as a way to purify it. Less, he believed, revealed truth, but over time, Zen stopped being about letting go. It became a system for deciding what didn't deserve to exist. In American popular culture, simplicity is often mistaken for peace. An empty room looks calm. An uncluttered desk feels focused. Jobs understood this language intuitively and mastered it. His homes reflected that mastery. They were stripped down not to welcome rest, but to enforce alignment. Every object had to justify itself. Every presence had to feel permanent. If something didn't feel eternally correct, it was excluded. This wasn't softness, it was authority. Where traditional Zen emphasizes compassion toward imperfection, Jobs practiced something closer to elimination. The goal wasn't balance, it was purity. And purity, once absolute, leaves no room for mercy. Visitors noticed the difference. What looked serene felt tense. Silence didn't relax the room, it charged it. Emptiness wasn't neutral, it was intentional. Nothing entered unless it passed an invisible test. This is how simplicity why becomes illusion. The space looks freeing, but it's tightly controlled. The rules are invisible, but relentless. In American history, there's a fine line between self-discipline and self-denial. The country praises restraint, but it also romanticizes warm family rooms, shared meals, lived-in spaces. Jobs rejected that softness because it implied permanence, repetition, routine. Zen gave him a narrative where refusal looked enlightened, a life without clutter, a home without attachments, a man unburdened by excess. But what was missing from that story was rest. Simplicity didn't slow him down. It kept him sharp, vigilant, unreachable. And slowly, it narrowed his world. The irony is painful. The philosophy meant to liberate him from desire became another mechanism of control. The pursuit of clarity erased comfort. The rejection of excess eliminated ease. Zen didn't quiet the judge inside Steve Jobs. It gave it better language. The same philosophy that brought Steve Jobs clarity, focus, and power had also trapped him in silence and control. Zen sharpened his standards but it didn't soften their consequences, and yet, there was one place where those standards worked almost flawlessly: Apple. To understand why, we have to look at a fundamental distinction Americans often blur: the difference between creating objects and living inside a life. At Apple, perfection lived inside boundaries. A product had a team, a deadline, a market. There was friction, resistance, argument, but eventually, there was release. A launch date forced closure. Time, not taste, made final decisions. Perfection there was brutal, but it was contained. At home, nothing forced an ending. No boardroom, no deadline, no launch day, just preference, unchecked. American innovation thrives on iteration. Silicon Valley celebrates the idea that you can be wrong today. and write tomorrow, fail fast, improve faster, ship, learn, repeat. Jobs mastered this environment. He could discard ideas without guilt because they belonged to teams, not himself. He could demand absurd precision because the cost was distributed. Pain was real, but it was shared, justified, and eventually rewarded. At home, there was no distribution. Every decision carried emotional weight. Choosing a chair wasn't just design, it was identity. A finished room wasn't iteration, it was permanence. At Apple, perfection was collaborative. At home, it was solitary. And solitude magnifies pressure. There's another reason the Apple system worked: substitution. If a prototype failed, it disappeared. If a design was wrong, it was replaced. Nothing was personal for long. Jobs' emotional investment was intense but transferable. A home doesn't allow substitution. You don't replace a life the way you replace a device. You live inside your choices. You feel them age, you wear them down with time. Steve Jobs never accepted that asymmetry. He approached life the way he approached products, assuming revision would always be possible, assuming Della Y carried no cost, assuming future clarity would rescue present discomfort, but bodies age. Time accumulates. Moments expire, and none of them accept updates. This is where American optimism quietly turns dangerous. The belief that everything can be improved later works beautifully in technology. It breaks down in human life. Jobs' brilliance trained him to believe friction was temporary, that resistance wasn't a signal but a challenge, that pushing harder would eventually break reality into compliance. At Apple, reality bent. At home, it didn't. The house never finished, the rooms never settled, the simplicity never softened. And slowly, the gap between genius and humanity widened. Steve Jobs could design a product millions would love, but love lives differently than admiration. It requires compromise, repetition, tolerance for good enough. Those qualities don't scale, they don't ship, they don't impress history, but hey are how people live. Power changes how standards behave, and by the time Apple reshaped the modern world, Steve Jobs possessed a rare kind of authority, not just financial, but cultural. His taste became law. His intuition carried weight. What he liked defined what millions would eventually desire. In American history, taste has always followed power. From industrial barons to Hollywood moguls, those at the top don't just consume culture, they manufacture it. Jobs was no exception, but unlike others, he didn't use power to soften his environment, he sharpened it. Jobs trusted his taste. More than almost anything else, he believed it revealed truth, not preference. The right curve, the right shade of white, the right feel in the hand. He wasn't guessing, he was seeing. That confidence made him formidable. It also made compromise impossible. In relationships, as in design, disagreement wasn't a difference of opinion, it was a sign someone hadn't yet understood. In spaces meant for comfort, authority replaced negotiation. What didn't align was eliminated. A completed home requires disagreement. It requires choosing something imperfect and living with it. It requires admitting that taste, no matter how refined, is not absolute. Jobs resisted that admission. American culture celebrates settling down as a victory. Marriage, mortgages, homes filled with accumulated life. They symbolize trust in the future, that things will hold. For Jobs, settling felt like decay. He had seen many companies collapse, too many ideas fossilize, too many people become trapped by choices they could no longer revise. To settle was to risk becoming static, and stasis, to him, was failure. The empty spaces he lived in preserved optionality. Nothing was permanent. Nothing could betray him by aging poorly. Power made this lifestyle possible. Wealth allowed endless postponement. Taste provided stification. Fear ensured it continued. Those close to him sensed a growing distance, not just emotional, but existential. Jobs lived ahead of time, not inside it, always building toward something undefined, always postponing the present in favor of a hypothetical future alignment. When choice becomes irreversible, power doesn't help. It isolates. Jobs commanded rooms filled with people, but he remained alone in decisions that actually mattered. The house that never finished wasn't an oversight. It was the purest expression of a man who refused to let anything finalize him. America often mistakes refusal for strength. We admire those who don't settle, who always demand more, who reject the ordinary. Steve Jobs became a myth built on that admiration. Boo. Myths rarely show the cost of endless authority applied inward. We saw how perfection worked inside Apple because it was bounded by systems, deadlines, and collective effort. Outside those structures, perfect iron became solitary and power removed the last remaining friction that might have forced Jobs to stop. In American history, power has always reshaped taste. The wealthy don't simply choose differently. Their choices redefine what good looks like for everyone else. From Rockefeller mansions to Hollywood modernism, authority has always dictated aesthetics. Steve Jobs stood in that lineage, but with a critical difference. Most powerful people use money to escape discomfort. Jobs used it to enforce standards. He didn't buy comfort, he bought optionality. Jobs true. Stead his taste the way other people trust facts. To him, taste wasn't subjective, it was diagnostic. If something felt wrong, it was wrong. Discussion didn't refine taste, it diluted it. This belief made him one of the most influential designers in history. It also made ordinary human compromise feel intolerable. A finished home is a negotiation between beauty and practicality, between ideals and daily use, between what looks right and what actually supports living. Jobs rejected that negotiation outright. Choosing furniture meant accepting that this was the best option among imperfect ones. Letting a house settle meant admitting that time, not intuition, would finish the job. For a man whose identity was built on rewriting reality, that was unbearable. There is a unique, only American fear underneath this, the fear of freezing at the wrong moment. To settle in American culture is double-edged. It suggests stability, but also stagnation. The same society that celebrates home ownership glorifies reinvention. You are encouraged to arrive, but never stop becoming. Jobs leaned entirely into the second half. He had watched companies ossify. He had been fired from his own Tian. He had seen how comfort dulls urgency. To him, settling wasn't peace, it was decay masquerading as success, so he kept his life unfinished. Empty rooms preserved motion. Lack of furniture preserved possibility. An unbuilt house preserved the fantasy that the perfect version was still coming. Power made this possible in ways most people never experience. Ordinary individuals are forced to choose because rent is due, families grow, time advances. Jobs didn't face those pressures in the same way. Money removed constraint, status removed accountability. Taste replaced negotiation. When nothing forces a decision, perfection becomes permanent delay. Those around him felt this asymmetry. Jobs could dismiss options endlessly without consequence. Others couldn't. It looked like discipline from the outside felt unlivable up close. He lived in perpetual preview mode. Not future-proofing a house, but future-proofing himself. This is where the story moves. Beyond architecture, the house was never the point. It was a symptom of a man who believed that stopping choosing finishing meant becoming ordinary. And to someone who had bent the world to his vision, ordinariness wasn't humility. It was failure. Power insulated Jobs from consequences most Americans can't avoid. Bills didn't force decisions. Space didn't demand efficiency. Time, for a long while, seemed negotiable. That insulation allowed him to live in a way that looked intentional, even philosophical. But power has a blind spot. It removes urgency. In American life, urgency is what turns ideals into habits. You choose a house because a family needs rooms. You buy furniture because people have to sit. You settle not because it's perfect but because life keeps moving. Whether you decide or not, Jobs' life moved differently. His authority delayed friction, his wealth postponed finality, and his fame wrapped those delays in myth. What might have looked like fear in another M was reframed as principle in him. Minimalism became meaning, delay became depth, absence became intention. But inside that framing, something vital went missing. People who spent time with Jobs noticed an emotional asymmetry. He could be deeply engaged, piercingly focused, then abruptly distant. Conversations felt provisional, like ideas waiting to mature. Even relationships carried an unfinished quality. The same standard applied everywhere. Nothing was allowed to be fully claimed unless it could be claimed forever. That's not how human attachment works. American culture teaches independence early, but it also teaches attachment through objects, family tables, shared spaces, worn furniture that carries memory. Homes are not optimized, they're accumulated. Jobs rejected accumulation because accumulation implies acceptance of time. And time was the one force he never believed would win. This is where taste becomes dangerous. Taste is absolute. It leaves no room for adaptation. When control replaces negotiation, life becomes brittle. And when power removes the need to choose, the act of choosing itself atrophies. Jobs wasn't indecisive. He was overqualified to decide and therefore unconstrained. He could always wait for something better. And so, he did. The house that never finished wasn't an accident of personality. It was the natural outcome of a system where desire outran consequence. But systems only work until something external intervenes. History shows this pattern repeatedly. Titans fall not when they're wrong but when the environment they mastered no longer applies. Industrialists undone by regulation, empires undone by time. Steve Jobs' reckoning wouldn't come from design, it would come from the body. What power couldn't protect him from was limitation. Aging doesn't ask for approval. Illness doesn't wait for alignment. Mortality doesn't care about stand. ARDS. And when those forces finally appeared, Jobs' life designed to remain flexible would face something it had avoided for decades, a deadline. Steve Jobs could postpone choices, resist finality, and live inside unfinished spaces, but there was one force power could not negotiate with. Time had been patient. Now it wasn't. In 2003, Jobs received a diagnosis that instantly redefined every unfinished thing in his life: pancreatic neuroendocrine cancer. It was a slower moving form, or said, treatable, manageable. There was time. Jobs heard something else. Delay was still possible. In classic American fashion, he rejected immediacy. He researched, he questioned, he pursued alternatives. The same instinct that never allowed him to accept good enough pushed him to resist conventional treatment. If there was a better solution, one more perfectly aligned with his beliefs, he would find it. America has always favored the self-directed hero, the man who outthinks experts, who trusts intuition over institutions. Jobs fit that narrative exactly. He believed discipline could substitute for vulnerability, that control could outmaneuver biology. For a while, it seemed to work. But illness changes the rules of design. Where once Jobs shaped environments, now environments shrank around him. Doctors' offices replaced boardrooms. The body introduced constraints no amount of taste could dissolve. There were fewer options, fewer delays, fewer future versions to wait for. And quietly, the cost of living unfinished became visible. A house that was never completed is less troubling when time feels infinite. When time contracts, unfinished things feel different. They no longer represent freedom, they represent risk. Friends recall a shift not dramatic, not sentimental, but unmistakable. Jobs became more aware of limits, less abstract, more human. The man who once treated life like an endless prototype was now facing a truth America struggles to talk about directly. Some things don't get revisions. No version T. Whoa. No redesign. No later. In American culture, illness often exposes character. It strips away mythology and leaves choices behind. Jobs didn't become suddenly gentle or nostalgic. He remained exacting, but something softened not in standards, but in urgency. The question changed. It was no longer is this perfect? It became will this be enough? The shy AFD is subtle, but it defines everything that follows. Time, once ignored, now occupied every decision. Homes, spaces, relationships, all the things he had postponed now stood as unresolved lines in a life approaching close. Jobs hadn't lived poorly. He had lived unfinished, and now finishing wasn't always possible. The house he refused to complete became more than metaphor. It was evidence of how he had lived, always aiming beyond the present, always trusting that alignment would come later. Illness removed that trust. For the first time, the absence of completion no longer felt discipline. It felt exposed. When time entered the room, it didn't do so loudly. It didn't announce itself with panic or collapse. It arrived the way it often does in American life, quietly, clinically, wrapped in the vocabulary of options, treatments, timelines, probabilities. For a man who had lived by deferring final decisions, this language was oddly familiar. At first, Steve Jobs treated illness the same way he treated design problems, as something that could be optimized. If there was a better path, cleaner, smarter, more precise, he believed discipline and insight would rev. It. This belief sits deep in American mythology, the idea that mastery, intelligence, and willpower can outthink fate itself. It's the same myth that built industries. It's also the that fails hardest at the end. As the conflict stretched on, something subtle became undeniable. Jobs' world was shrinking not in ambition, but in scale. The future no longer expanded indefinitely. Choices narrowed, delays carried weight. And unfinished things began to surface. In American culture, legacy is often measured externally. Companies built, fortunes made, names remembered. By that metric, Jobs had nothing left to prove. Apple was not just successful, it was culturally embedded. His design philosophy had reshaped the everyday behavior of millions. But legacy inside a private life works differently. It's quieter. It lives in rooms, in objects chosen or avoided, in spaces that either hold memory or resist it. The house that never finished started to matter in a new way, not because it was large, not because it was expensive, but because it represented something he had postponed believing in: sufficiency. As illness imposed limits, Jobs was forced into a perspective most Americans resist until they can't. That progress does not cancel time. That waiting does not preserve possibility forever. That perfection delayed long enough turns into something else entirely. Loss. Those around him noticed. Moments, not speeches. Not revelations, but shifts. Jobs spent more time with family. He spoke in shorter frames. Less hypothetical, more immediate. The man who once lived several versions ahead of himself was beginning to inhabit the present. And the present asked different questions than design ever had. Not what could this be, but what is this now? American culture is deeply uncomfortable with that question. It prefers potential. It prefers ambition. It prefers narratives that climb. But illness forces stillness. It removes the illusion that everything important lies just ahead. In stillness, incompletion loses its elegance. Unfinished rooms stop resembling discipline. They start resembling absence. This teaming Jobs suddenly regretted his life. Regret implies a mistake. and his standards had built extraordinary things. But clarity doesn't always demand regret. Sometimes it demands recognition. Recognition that some values work best within systems and fail within bodies. Recognition that control, when unchallenged, becomes fragility. Recognition that the freedom to delay is not the same. He is the freedom to live. Time did not ask Steve Jobs to redesign himself. It simply removed the option. By the time illness stopped being abstract, Steve Jobs no longer spoke in the language of possibility. The future, once his primary residence, had collapsed into something narrower, something immediate. For most of his life, Jobs lived ahead of the present. He designed for what's see, arms next, imagined needs before people voiced them, and trusted that alignment would eventually arrive if he waited long enough. That way of thinking had always favored delay. Why commit now when the tool would arrive cleaner, sharper, more correct? Illness removed that logic. The body does not care about readiness. Time does not accept rescheduling. As treatments intensified and energy faded, very unfinished choice gained weight. Not dramatic weight, the kind loud enough for speeches, but practical weight. Where to sit? How long to stay? What mattered today? Not high path. Tickily, American culture offers few narratives for this transition. We celebrate comeback stories and heroic defiance far more than adjustment. There is little cultural language for letting go without defeat. Jobs had to find his own. This is where the house, once an abstract symbol, became a real measure. Homes are about continuity. They hold the ordinary. Meals, routines, quiet repetition. These are not optimized experiences. They are accepted ones. Jobs had built his life around optimizing the world. Now he was facing a narrowing reality where acceptance, not improvement, was the operative skill. And acceptance is not passive. It is learned. People around him noticed fewer arguments, fewer revisions, fewer deferrals. Jobs was still demanding, but the object of the dimmer and had shifted. Precision mattered most where it saved energy, not where it proved taste. For perhaps the first time, restraint wasn't philosophical. It was physical. In American history, aging forces a reckoning. The country prizes youth not just because it's energetic, but because it's flexible. Youth implies rewriting. Age implies living with what's already written. Jobs had always lived as if rewriting were infinite. Now, every choice felt final. What he left unfinished could no longer be dismissed as optional. The empty spaces he once defended as intentional now sat alongside a different question: who would live with these choices once he couldn't anymore? Even in this moment, Jobs didn't turn sentimental, but he became aware of something perfect. Time had long obscured. Meaning does not always improve when delayed. Some things gain their value from being used, not perfected. From being lived inside, not designed endlessly. Illness did not soften Steve Jobs into a different person. It clarified him. It revealed the limits of a life built entirely around future alignment. It showed where brilliance becomes brittle when it refuses ordinary human compromise. The collapsed future didn't destroy his philosophy. It tested it. And the test was simple. When the next version never arrives, what version are you willing to stand by? By the time Steve Jobs reached the final stretches of his illness, something fundamental had shifted, not in his intellect, but in his relationship with time. For decades, Jobs had lived ahead of himself. He made decisions for the future, argued with the present, and treated now as a temporary inconvenience on the way to something better. That posture had shaped modern technology. It had also shaped his life. But illness collapses distance. What once felt like an endless horizon compresses into a narrow corridor. Days are no longer interchangeable. Energy becomes scarce. Attention becomes selective. The future, once expansive, becomes fragile. This is where American culture offers almost no guidance. The nation is built around expansion of territory, of markets, of possibility. Its heroes move forward, not inward. Stopping is rarely framed as wisdom. It's framed as defeat. Steve Jobs had spent his entire life resisting defeat. Now, stopping was unavoidable. Those around him noticed a change that was difficult to describe, not softer standards. Not a loss of edge, but presence. Jobs listened differently. He spoke less about what could be and more about what was. His attention narrowed, but it sharpened. The man who once lived 10 years ahead was beginning finally to live where he actually was. This did not mean he suddenly embraced comfort or imperfection. It meant he stopped treating incompletion as protection. The strategy that once preserved possibility now revealed its limits. An unfinished life offers no shelter when time runs out. The empty house, the undecided rooms, the postponed settling, they no longer represented freedom. They represented distance from something fundamentally human, inhabiting one's own life without reservation. In American history, the hardest transitions are quiet ones. Not collapse, not scandal, but adjustment. Accepting that some chapters will not be revised, that some completeness will never arrive on its own. Jobs did not rewrite his life in the end. He acknowledged it. Acknowledgement is not surrender. It is alignment with reality. Something Jobs had demanded of others relentlessly, but resisted for himself. He began to understand something perfectionism often hides: the value of things lived imperfectly, but fully. Homes are not designed to be admired. They are designed to hold life while it passes. Jobs had always designed for admiration. Now he was forced to consider entrance. This moment doesn't redeem or condemn him. It clarifies him. Steve Jobs was not wrong to demand excellence. He was wrong to expect that the same mechanisms that shape products could organize a human existence indefinitely. Illness stripped away the illusion that alignment would always come later. It forced the present to be inhabited, not deferred. For a man who built the future, this was the most unfamiliar terrain of all. If perfection shaped everything he built, what did it take from him? To ask that question honestly, we have to look beyond the myth, armor. Icon culture loves clean narratives. Genius must be justified. Flaws must be redeemed. But real lives rarely cooperate with neat conclusions. Steve Jobs didn't live incorrectly. He lived intensely. And intensity always extracts a price. In American history, figures like Jobs are celebrated not because they were balanced, but because they were uncompromising. The nation reveres those who push limits, even when they break others or themselves in the process. Progress, in this mythology, is always worth the disruption it causes. Jobs fit that story perfectly. His standards eliminated mediocrity. His refusal to accept good enough forced industries forward. Millions benefited from tools that felt inevitable only because someone refused to accept ordinariness. Perfection, W, as his gift. But gifts reshape the person who carries them. Jobs' perfectionism trained him to distrust comfort. It taught him that ease was a warning sign, that completion meant stagnation, that settling into a life, even a beautiful one, risked losing edge. In American terms, he lived like a pioneer long after the frontier was gone. Pioneers don't build homes to stay in, they build them to move on from. The unfinished house, the empty rooms, the delayed decisions, these weren't personal failures. They were perfectly consistent with a worldview that values motion over roots. But motion is not the same as living. The cost appears subtle, not dramatic, a discomfort with rest, a reluctance to allow space for the ordinary, difficulty accepting imperfection in domains that don't improve through force. Perfection punishes ambiguity. Life thrives on it. When these two values collide, something has to give. Steve Jobs solved that conflict not by fenning his standards, but by avoiding the environments where they would have to bend. Homes demand repetition. Relationships demand forgiveness. Bodies demand care rather than correction. Perfection can't dominate those realms without consequence. American culture struggles with this paradox. It teaches us that greatness requires obsession, but rarely asks where obsession ends. It sets standards, but rarely examines how they age. Jobs aged inside his standards. Only when time no longer allowed avoidance did the trade-offs become visible. This isn't an indictment, it's a recognition. Every philosophy excels in some terrains and fails in others. Jobs changed the world by refusing to accept systems as they were. But when applied to the livable spaces of human existence, that same refusal narrowed his capacity for ease. Perfection built the future. It complicated the present. By the time we ask whether perfection was a gift or a cost, we're already too late to separate the two. For Steve Jobs, perfection wasn't a habit he could turn off. It wasn't a tool he picked up for work and set down at home. It became identity. And identity, once fused with a philosophy, is almost impossible to renegotiate. In American culture, this fusion is often celebrated. We admire people who are their work. We speak of vocation as destiny. From inventors to artists to founders, the ideal figure is someone who doesn't merely do great things, but cannot do anything else. Jobs embodied that archetype. But when perfection becomes identity, compromise stops being practical, it becomes existential. Adjusting standards doesn't feel like strategy. It feels like self-erasure. This is why the house mattered more than it appeared to. A finish. The house would have marked a boundary, a place where job standards had to bow to daily use, to wear, to repetition. It would have meant admitting that some things are meant to be lived with, not mastered. That admission clashed with how he understood himself. Jobs didn't see perfection as a preference. He saw it as responsibility. If he knew what right looked like, allowing anything less felt dishonest, not just professionally, but morally. In American ideology, moral clarity is power. The person who knows becomes leader. The person who doubts becomes follower. Jobs chose knowing even when it isolated him. What's rarely discussed is how exhausting this position is. If you are always right, you are also always alone. Perfection leaves no peer, only correction. It trains you to see errors instantly and to feel them viscerally. A crooked seam, an inelegant line, an awkward compromise doesn't fade into the background. It occupies attention relentlessly. Most people unconsciously relax their standards at home. That relief is what turns houses into shelter. Jobs never allowed himself. That release reminded his standards followed him everywhere. So his private world became an extension of his public one, controlled, curated and emotionally distant. American history is filled with figures who lived like this. Thomas Edison, Howard Hughes, men whose inner worlds calcified around a single governing idea. The same intensity that unlocked brilliance also narrowed flexibility. Jobs avoided their most extreme outcomes, but he shared their tension. The question, then, is not whether perfection was worth it. That framing assumes a choice. For Jobs, it wasn't optional. To abandon perfection would have meant abandoning the self he had become. That's the invisible cost. When your standards give you greatness, they also take away alternatives. You don't get to find out who you would have been if you were gentler, more accepting, more willing to live among imperfections. Those versions remain theoretical, like the house that stayed unbuilt. This doesn't diminish what Jobs gave the world. It sharpens our understanding of it. He didn't trade happiness for success. He traded flexibility for clarity, ease for alignment, settlement for motion. And as time narrowed his choices, the cost wasn't regret but recognition that perfection, once internalized, doesn't ask whether it should apply everywhere. It simply does. To understand Steve Jobs fully, you have to understand the country that produced him, America has always made a quiet contract with its heroes. If you give us the future, we will forgive you for not inhabiting the present. This is the unspoken bargain behind nearly every American legend, from industrialists to artists to tech founders. We accept imbalance as the price of impact. We excuse obsession because it moves the world forward. Steve Jobs did not invent this contract, he fulfilled it, and the house he refused to finish fits perfectly inside it. In the American imagination, greatness is rarely gentle, it is sharp-edged, single-minded, and often isolating. Balance is something we praise in hindsight, but not while the work is happening. Jobs lived where American culture gives its highest rewards, at the intersection of confidence and refusal. Refusal to accept what existed, refusal to slow down, refusal to treat enough as meaningful. His discomfort at home was not aberration. It was alignment. A finished house would have symbolized arrival, closure, satisfaction, but American greatness depends on dissatisfaction. We expect our innovators to live restless lives, so we don't have to. Their disorder becomes our convenience. Their unfinished edges become our finished products. Jobs' perfectionism wasn't just personal pathology. It was culturally reinforced. This is why the house never finished fair. Else haunting, not tragic. It represents the cost. Americans quietly accept that the people who build our tools may never get to use them the way the rest of us do. That the ones who design simplicity may live inside complexity. Jobs showed the world how to reduce friction, but he absorbed friction himself. He optimized products so others could feel ease. He dismissed good enough so others wouldn't have to. That asymmetry is not accidental, it's structural. And this is where the story stops being about Steve Jobs alone. The question he leaves behind isn't, was he happy? It's, what do we expect from greatness? Do we demand perfection without mercy? Do we reward results without asking about costs? Do we celebrate people who never stop improving, and quietly accept that they may never stop resting? Jobs' life suggests that perfection, once rewarded at scale, becomes difficult to contain. It wants to reorganize everything: work, space, values, even silence. The house that stayed unfinished wasn't a failure of execution. It was the natural endpoint of a life lived under an American definition of success that rarely asks where to stop. By the time we reach this point, the story no longer belongs only to Steve Jobs. It opens into a question larger than any individual life. What happens when perfection delivers everything it promises? Success, impact, cultural influence, but withholds the one thing it can never manufacture: rest. Steve Jobs changed how the world communicates, works, listens to music, and thinks about design. His fingerprints are everywhere. And yet, inside his own life, perfection did not transform into peace. It did not soften into belonging. It did not return something equivalent to what it demanded. This is not irony. It is structure. Perfection is asymmetrical. It extracts discipline, focus, and sacrifice in precise proportions, but it does not refund comfort, closure, or ease. Those must come from acceptance, not achievement. Jobs did not misunderstand that. He simply chose differently. In American culture, we often confuse control with freedom. We assume that if we refine something enough, it will eventually stop resisting us, that if standards are high enough, life will align itself. Steve Jobs tested that belief to its absolute limit. He bent technology to his will. He bent teams. He bent markets. But life is not made of components. It cannot be machined, optimized, or corrected without residue. It carries wear. It accumulates compromise. It demands tolerance for what remains unresolved. The house he never finished was not a rejection of comfort. It was a refusal to surrender control to time. And time never relinquishes control. What T. Jobs leaves us, then, is not a warning but a boundary, a demonstration of where excellence ends and humanity begins. Perfection works best where outputs matter more than inner experience. It excels in arenas with feedback loops, revision cycles, and deadlines. It collapses in places where meaning is cumulative, not optimized. Homes, bodies, relationships, these are not design problems. They are living systems. Steve Jobs did not fail at life. He succeeded at exactly what he trained himself to do. But his life reveals something uncomfortable for a culture that idolizes obsession. You can build the future and still feel unfinished. You can remove friction from the world and remain tense within it. You can insist on better forever and never feel done. The unfinished house stands as proof of that truth, not as a mistake, not as tragedy, but as an honest artifact. It tells us that perfection can design everything except surrender. And with surrender, no life, no matter how influential, ever really settles. It was never about architecture, zoning laws, or modernist design. It was about where a man placed the burden of meaning in his life and away. He refused to place it. Steve Jobs died without finishing the house because, in many ways, he never believed in finishing the present. He believed in what came after. The next idea, the next sign, the next alignment where everything would finally feel right. And yet, the world remembers him as someone who finished things. The iPhone was finished. The Macintosh was finished. The VC on of how technology should feel was finished. It is only his personal life that remains oddly open-ended. In American history, unfinished monuments are rare. We like closure. We like grand science. We like to believe that success leads to peace. Steve Jobs disrupts that belief. His life suggests something more uncomfortable. That you can give the world coherence without ever feeling settled inside yourself. That excellence does not automatically soften into rest. That standards, once perfected, do not necessarily know when to stop. The house he refused to complete does not end him, it explains him. Perhaps the most dangerous part of perfectionism is not its cruelty, but its promise. It convinces people that satisfaction lies just beyond the next correction, that rest will arrive once everything aligns. For Steve Jobs, that moment never came, not because he failed, but because his definition of enough was always future-bound. And maybe that's the quiet lesson this unfinished house leaves behind. Not about ambition, not about genius, but about timing. There are things that only gain value when you allow them to be used, not optimized. Spaces that only become meaningful when you stop correcting them. Lives that only settle when you stop asking whether they could be better. Steve Jobs showed us how powerful refusal can be. He also showed us its cost. So the story doesn't end with regret or redemption or a moral verdict. It ends with an open door, an unfinished room, a question passed forward instead of answered. When do you stop designing your life and start living inside it? We'll pull back even further, stepping beyond Steve Jobs to explore other visionaries who refuse to settle and ask whether obsession is the engine of greatness or the price history quietly demands. Because the house Steve Jobs never finished may not be unique. It may be the blueprint we keep repeating.